On that particular June afternoon, St. Mary Mead looked as though nothing disagreeable had ever happened there, or ever could. The sky was a polite English blue, the sun shone without vulgar enthusiasm, and the lawns behind the vicarage, freshly mown and smelling faintly of cut grass and linseed oil from the cricket pitch beyond, were dotted with trestle tables and gently wilting bunting. It was the day of the vicarage garden fefty, a fixture so firmly established in the village calendar that newcomers soon learned to speak of it with a hushed, almost ecclesiastical respect. There had been weeks of preparation, jam boiling in kitchen after kitchen, fierce debates over sponge cake texture, and whispered discussion over whether Mrs. Price Ridley's roses would, this year, decisively outshine those of Colonel and Mrs. Bantry. At the edge of it all, comfortably settled in a wicker chair near the tea-table, sat Miss Jane Marple. She wore a straw hat, which had seen many summers, but was adorned with a fresh blue ribbon, and her knitting lay, as it so often did, in her lap, though her needles moved less than people supposed, and her faded blue eyes more. "Really, Jane, you have the best seat in the house," remarked Mrs. Bantry, fluttering down beside her with the energy of a well-preserved bird of prey. "You can see everything." Miss Marple smiled. "One does see a great deal, from a quiet corner," she agreed. "Though I assure you, Dolly, it is only cakes and coconuts today." That remark was perhaps not entirely accurate, for beyond the stalls a white elephant jumble, a bric-a-brac of tarnished candlesticks and dreadful vases, a shy display of local handicrafts, there loomed the reason this particular 50 was a little more ambitious than usual, a charity exhibition in aid of the restoration of the temple of the Three Blind Monks. The temple, in reality, was no more than a slightly absurd 18th-century folly in the grounds of the Grange, the big house just outside the village now belonging to Sir Lewis Carmichael, the industrial magnate. A circular stone structure with 3 weather-worn monkish figures carved in relief, their eyes bandaged with lichen-stained stone. It had long been regarded as a picturesque but crumbling curiosity. Sir Lewis, newly arrived and anxious to endear himself, had offered to fund a full restoration, provided the village would show, as he said in his rather booming manner, a bit of old-fashioned community spirit. "There he is," murmured Mrs. Bantry now, inclining her head. "Our benefactor. One could almost forgive him those frightful factories." Sir Lewis Carmichael was a large, well-fleshed man, with a surprisingly youthful moustache and a habit of patting people's shoulders as though they were recalcitrant machinery. He was making his way through the crowd accompanied by his much younger wife, Lydia, whose cool, pale beauty had already given rise to more speculation in the village than any number of industrial enterprises. "Such a difference in age," Mrs. Bantry had said once, with tactful vagueness, though of course it must be companionship. Now Lady Lydia walked a fraction ahead of her husband, her expression polite and remote. Miss Marple watched her for a moment over the rim of her teacup, then allowed her gaze to drift on, taking in Major Harper. Red-faced already from the sun and the beer tent, Mrs. Price Ridley. Stiff with disapproval at the sight of a jazz gramophone, young Reverend Julian Harmon anxiously overseeing the tombola, and hovering at the outskirts, a lean, dark young man with an easel under his arm. "That is the artist," supplied Mrs. Bantry. "Mr. Gale. Sir Lewis has invited him to sketch the temple. Terribly modern, they say." "Modern," said Miss Marple mildly, "can mean so many things, Dolly. Not all of them comfortable." It might have been fancy that made her notice then the swift glance Lady Lydia cast in the young artist's direction, or the way Mr. Gale's fingers tightened momentarily on his easel. Certainly no one else appeared to see it. The band struck up a valiantly out-of-tune waltz, and attention turned to the opening speech. Sir Lewis planted himself upon the small wooden platform erected near the rose-beds. He spread his hands, beamed, and began to talk. Of heritage, of responsibility, of the honor of preserving the temple of the 3 blind monks for future generations. His voice rolled over the assembly like a benevolent fog. People clapped in roughly the right places. A child cried. Someone dropped a plate. And then, quite suddenly, there came another sound. It emerged from the direction of the lane leading up to the grange. A thin, high scream, followed by a man's shout and the unmistakable crash of something heavy falling. Conversation froze. Heads turned. The jazz gramophone gave a protesting squawk and fell silent. Miss Marple's knitting slipped from her lap as she rose, surprisingly quickly for so small and elderly a lady. Her eyes, very blue and very sharp, were fixed upon the gate, where a breathless gardener now appeared, his cap askew and his face an alarming color. Sir Lewis," he gasped. "At the temple there's been a terrible accident." But even as he spoke, Miss Marple, who had seen too many accidents in her long and observant life, knew with a small, cold certainty that it was nothing of the sort. For a moment there was only the faint rattle of china and the far-off drone of a lawn-mower from some neighboring garden, mindlessly continuing its progress through a world that ought to have stopped. Then the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, gave a small, hysterical sob, and at once the lawn was full of sound, questions, exclamations, protests, all tumbling over each other. Dead? But he was standing there a moment ago. Heart must be the heart. Dr. Haydock, surely. Someone fetch the constable. Miss Marple did not add her voice to the confusion. Instead, she quietly set down her knitting and moved her chair back a little, so that she could see more without appearing to do so. Years of experience had taught her that the first few minutes after a sudden death were often the most enlightening. Julian Pendergast was shaking so violently that the brass monk in his hands rattled faintly. I don't understand," he stammered. "He only touched it. He only touched the statue." Sir Lewis Carmichael rounded on him. "Touched it? What do you mean, touched it? He never drank his tea. Look, the cup's still full." Miss Marple's eyes passed over the cup, the saucer, the pale ring of moisture on the tablecloth where something else had been set down in haste. Mr. Finch had arrived late, she recalled. He had refused a sandwich with a faint grimace, but he had been quite willing to handle the monk. "Poison, do you think?" Mrs. Bantry whispered to no one in particular, though Miss Marple heard her distinctly. "You remember old Mrs. Petherick's nephew in Little Crampton, dropped dead just like that. Only it turned out to be his own pills. Best not to speculate," Miss Marple said mildly. "Things are rarely what they seem at first sight, in my experience." Police Constable Abel Jones arrived, pink-faced and solemn, having been summoned by a breathless maid. He cleared his throat importantly, took in the prone body on the grass and the huddle of respectable villagers around it, and looked rather as if he wished the ground would open and swallow him. "We must wait for the inspector," Dr. Haydock said. "Jones, keep everyone here. No one leaves until Inspector Slack has taken statements." At the mention of Inspector Slack, there was a faint, almost imperceptible tightening around Miss Marple's lips. Slack was a good man in his way, but inclined to be impatient with what he termed old ladies' fancies. "I didn't do anything," Julian Pendergast burst out suddenly, startling them all. "You mustn't think I mean he insisted on examining it. I was only showing Uncle Silas's things for the charity." "You all saw." "Of course we did," Lydia Carmichael said gently. Her voice was low and musical, and her long white hands rested lightly on the back of her husband's chair. Yet Miss Marple noticed that the knuckles were very slightly whitened. "No one is accusing you, Mr. Pendergast." Yet Sir Lewis muttered under his breath. Miss Marple's sharp ears caught the single word. She observed how Sir Lewis's heavy gaze lingered on the brass monk, and how even now a curious glitter lay in his eyes. Men, she reflected, were sadly predictable where objects of value were concerned. Within half an hour the lawn, once so peaceful, had acquired a new grim order. Finch's body had been decently covered with a rug from the vicarage. Mrs. Clement, her colour restored by brandy, was indoors with the more delicate ladies, and Inspector Slack, square-shouldered and brisk, stood by the tea-table making notes. Name? He demanded of the assembled group. Address? How long have you known the deceased? Barely at all, Mrs. Bantry said. He only came to the village a fortnight ago. Took the mill cottage. Such a quiet man, except for his eyes, I always said. And you, Miss Marple? Slack turned, almost reluctantly. Oh, I knew nothing about him, Miss Marple said. Only that he watched things very closely, the way a person watches when they are frightened, or perhaps when they are remembering. She smiled apologetically. An old woman's observation, nothing more, Slack grunted. But he wrote something down all the same. The next morning dawned with deceptive brightness, as though the sky had decided to ignore the small calamity that had unsettled St. Mary Mead. Yet in the high street and at cottage gates, the village mind had already arranged the previous afternoon into a satisfying narrative. At the butcher's, Mrs. Price Ridley confided to anyone within earshot that Mr. Finch had surely been a smuggler of antiquities, hunted down in spiritual retribution. At the grocer's, Miss Hartnell was darkly certain it was Bolshevik agents. In the post office, however, the tone was more practical. Mrs. Lestrange, who prided herself on worldly knowledge, hinted at scandal in Finch's London life. It's always women in the end, she declared, weighing out sugar, or money, and often both together. Miss Marple, collecting her letters with unobtrusive calm, neither contradicted nor encouraged these pronouncements. She merely tucked a postcard from her great niece into her handbag and asked a few apparently vague questions. Such an odd thing, his dying like that, she murmured. Did anyone know much about Mr. Finch, I wonder? Where he came from, what he did? Mrs. Lestrange sniffed, said he was a dealer in art. Or perhaps antiquities. Came from London. That much I know. Took the mill cottage for 3 months. Paid in advance, too, which is always suspicious in my opinion. Very thoughtful of him to die so conveniently soon after arriving, Miss Marple said mildly. One would almost say he'd hardly had time to commit anything worth being murdered for. She left the post office with the air of one whose curiosity had been gently whetted, not sharpened. Yet as she walked past the green and the tiny library, she turned the information over in her mind. A dealer in antiquities, knowledgeable about values, a rare brass statue with a supposed twin history, a notebook that had vanished, and a method of poisoning that suggested premeditation more than impulse. At 11 o'clock, she took it upon herself to call at the vicarage under the pretext of returning a borrowed gardening book. Mrs. Clement, pale and fluttery, received her with the half-guilty air of someone presiding over a house that has recently hosted a death. Inspector Slack has been simply everywhere, she lamented. He's asked the most dreadful questions, Jane. About Julian's uncle, about the collection, even about the new curtains for the parish hall, as if that could possibly have anything to do with poison. Inspectors must justify their presence, Miss Marple said soothingly. And did our good inspector discover anything of consequence? Mrs. Clement lowered her voice. He is quite determined that it is suicide. Says Finch may have had the poison on his person and used the statue as a melodramatic stage. Julian is distraught, of course. He feels somehow responsible for providing the setting. Poor young man. Might I see him for a moment? Merely to offer sympathy. She found Julian Pendergast in his small study, hunched over a stack of correspondence, his fair hair rumpled as though he had raked his hands through it many times. "Miss Marple," he said miserably, rising, "I cannot help feeling, if I had not brought the collection." "Nonsense." Mr. Pendergast, "if someone desires to poison another, they will contrive to do so whether monks, blind or otherwise, are present or not. Tell me, this statue, how long have you had it in your possession?" "Only a fortnight," he said. "It came among Uncle Silas's effects. I thought it so curious, and with the temple of the 3 blind monks on Sir Lewis's land being restored, it seemed a harmless little theme." Uncle Silas being Silas Pendergast. Lived abroad most of his life. Dealt in curios, I believe. Quite eccentric. And you kept the statue where? In the vestry safe until yesterday morning. I fetched it myself, and no one else knew it was there? He hesitated. Well, Sir Lewis did. He asked to see it earlier in the week. He'd heard of it from Mrs. Bantry. And Mr. Finch came by 2 days ago, introduced himself as a specialist dealer. Said he'd heard a rumor about an Eastern idol in a village church and wondered if it might be of interest. "Dear me," Miss Marple said softly. "How very quickly news travels when there is money attached to it. When she left the vicarage, she did not go directly home. Instead, she turned up the lane toward the Carmichael estate, where the folied temple of the 3 blind monks rose from the trees, like something out of an over-ornamented dream. It seemed to her that if one wished to understand the death that had so suddenly visited St. Mary Mead, one must begin with the living structure that shared its name." 2 days later, Inspector Slack called at Miss Marple's cottage, more from a sense of duty than any belief that she might assist. He accepted her offer of tea with the air of a man resigned to a necessary social inconvenience, then perched somewhat awkwardly on the edge of her chintz-covered armchair. "We've just had Finch Hadley's belongings brought up from the cottage by the mill," he announced, stirring his tea with unnecessary vigor. "Nothing useful. A few books on Eastern art, a battered suitcase, some clothes, and a typewriter with half a chapter of some nonsense about temple architecture." "How disappointing," Miss Marple said placidly. "Did you, by any chance, come across a small leather notebook?" Slack paused, eyeing her sharply. "And what makes you ask that, Miss Marple?" "Oh, merely an old woman's recollection," she replied mildly. "When Mr. Finch collapsed, I happened to see such a notebook fall from his pocket. It seems not to have been recorded among his effects." The inspector's jaw tightened. "If there was such a notebook, someone must have picked it up before I arrived, which is neither here nor there, as we already know what killed him. The coroner confirms cyanide, most likely self-administered." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose the merest fraction. "Self-administered? From where, may I ask?" Slack shifted. "We've found traces of cyanide on the blindfold of that wretched statue. Sodbury swears no one's bought any from him recently, and I believe him. Whoever did this had it before they came to the tea. Finch Hadley was the only one who handled the statue directly. And you consider that proof of suicide?" "It's enough for a practical man," Slack said shortly. "He was up to his neck in debts, it seems, had letters from moneylenders. Likely decided to make a spectacle of himself. People do." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "I have known people to commit suicide in curious ways, Inspector, but seldom in a manner that leaves opportunity for others to be suspected. Human nature being what it is, those in despair generally think of themselves, not the dramatic effect." He snorted but rose, setting down his cup. "You leave human nature to me this time, Miss Marple. I'll have this wrapped up before long, and I'll find whoever pocketed that notebook. Never you fear." When he had gone, Miss Marple sat very still, her hands folded over her knitting. Suicide, indeed. She thought of Mr. Finch Hadley's expression as he had reached for the statue, interested, calculating, quite untroubled. Not the look of a man about to die by his own hand. That afternoon brought another visitor, Lydia Carmichael, arriving alone and looking unusually pale beneath her impeccable hat. "I do hope I'm not intruding, Miss Marple," she began, removing her gloves with fingers that trembled ever so slightly. "But I felt I must speak to someone sensible. Louis is, well, he's been quite different since the tea." Miss Marple received her with gentle solicitude. "Your husband has been much occupied with the restoration of his Temple of the Three Blind Monks, has he not?" "Obsessed, more like," Lydia said with uncharacteristic bitterness. "At first it was merely a hobby, something to occupy him, but when he heard about that wretched statue, it became an idfix. He means to have it, Miss Marple. He says it belongs with the temple, and that no curate's sentimental attachment should stand in the way of historical completeness. Indeed?" Miss Marple's tone was one of mild curiosity. "And what has Mr. Pendergast said to that?" He refused. Lydia's eyes darted nervously toward the window, quite firmly for once. Said it was all he had left of his uncle. Louis was furious. Then, after Mr. Finch died, Louis became strangely quiet. Too quiet. Yesterday I found him in his study with a sheaf of papers, correspondence with some London dealer about acquiring the second monk, by arrangement. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "The second monk?" "Yes. Apparently there are, or were, 3 originally. The Temple Folly is modeled after some pagan shrine, and Louis discovered an old legend that the 3 statues together form a complete set worth a small fortune. Only one has ever been found, that is, Mr. Pendergast's. At least, that's what Louis believes." Miss Marple smoothed her skirt thoughtfully. "How very interesting. And your husband is a man accustomed to getting what he wants, I imagine." Lydia gave a small, hopeless laugh. "Louis has never tolerated obstacles. Not in business. Not in anything." As the younger woman left, Miss Marple stood for a while at her garden gate, watching Lydia's retreating figure. A determined industrialist, a suddenly valuable artifact, a dead collector of Eastern curiosities, and a missing notebook that might well contain rather more than scholarly jottings. The pattern, she reflected, was growing clearer, but one small, elusive piece was still missing. Miss Marple did not have long to wait for her fears about Mr. Pendergast to be confirmed. The very next morning, as she was tidying her small sitting room, Inspector Slack's car drew up outside with a displeased growl, and moments later his heavy tread sounded on her garden path. He came in reluctantly, almost defensively, as though anticipating argument. "I thought you'd like to know, Miss Marple," he began, refusing tea for once. "We've made some progress. Significant progress. How very satisfactory," Miss Marple said placidly, folding her hands. "You have, I presume, found a likely suspect?" Slack looked almost triumphant. "We have more than that. We've got opportunity, motive, and physical evidence, all pointing in one direction. Your young friend, the curate. Mr. Pendergast?" There was the faintest lift of her brows, no more. "That is surprising, is it?" Slack leaned forward. "Finch Hadley visited him privately the evening before the tea. We now know they argued." Mrs. Clement heard raised voices through the study door. "Something about money and what you owe me." Not the sort of thing one expects from a man of the cloth. Miss Marple's expression remained mild. "Arguments occur in all walks of life, Inspector, even in parsonages. That hardly proves murder. It doesn't have to, not on its own. But we also found this." He produced, with an air of drama, a small glass vial in a brown paper evidence bag. discovered under a loose board in the curate's study, clearly disturbed recently. Traces of cyanide. The lab confirmed it this morning. "How thorough of you," Miss Marple murmured. "And the third piece of your case?" Slack hesitated, then allowed himself a small smirk. "Financial records. The bishop's office confirms Pendergast has substantial gambling debts. Cards, mostly. Not as young and innocent as he looks, that one. Finch Hadley, being from that world, likely recognized him. Threatened exposure. So the curate arranges a little village entertainment, laces the statue, and waits. She seemed to consider this very carefully. And how, may I ask? Do you imagine Mr. Pendergast applied the poison without endangering himself? Gloves, Slack said promptly. We found a pair of rubber gloves in his wastepaper basket. Traces of the same substance. It's quite straightforward. Things that appear straightforward, Miss Marple said gently, are sometimes arranged to look that way, Inspector. Slack rose, brushing imaginary crumbs from his coat. With respect, Miss Marple, this isn't one of your village tales about wicked housemaids. We've got hard evidence. I'll be questioning Pendergast formally this afternoon, and I imagine the chief constable will approve charges shortly after. After he had gone, Miss Marple sat very still for some minutes, her gaze resting not on any particular object, but somewhere beyond the little room altogether. Then, with a small sigh, she rose, took her hat and coat, and walked to the church. She found Mr. Pendergast alone in the vestry, his usually neat desk a confusion of papers and open ledgers. He sprang to his feet at the sight of her, his face haggard. "They've been here, Miss Marple," he said hoarsely. "The police. They showed me that vial as though I had. You don't believe I?" She regarded him with kind, clear eyes. "I believe, my dear, that you are far too ingenuous to have committed so efficient and complicated a crime. Which is not at all the same thing as saying the evidence will not point very convincingly in your direction." He sank back into his chair. "But I never owned such a vial. I swear it. And the gloves, I use gloves for polishing the church brasses. I threw that pair out weeks ago. Anyone might have." "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. "Anyone might. That, you see, is rather the point." Her eyes moved slowly around the little room, the polish on the brass cross, the faint chemical tang in the air, the open window that looked onto the churchyard path. And then she saw it. A tiny smear of greenish-brown on the inside of the window latch. Quite invisible to a casual glance, but unmistakable to someone who had once observed a charwoman hide her employer's silver polish in a flower pot to avoid extra work. "I wonder, Mr. Pendergast," she said, "who besides yourself has had free access to this room in the past week?" He blinked. Why? Anyone helping with the Harvest Festival decorations?" Lady Carmichael arranged the rota. Sir Lewis was here twice about the memorial plaque. And of course, Mrs. Price Ridley insists on checking the flower arrangements personally. "But you don't think—" "I think," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "that someone has been very industrious indeed, and that if we do not act quickly, the village will be quite content to see an innocent man hanged, so long as it makes a good story for the next fortnight." Miss Marple placed the anonymous note on the mantelpiece, securing it with a small china shepherdess, as though it were no more than a recipe to be tried later. Then she put on her hat and coat with the unhurried deliberation of age, and walked up the lane toward Carmichael Hall. The estate, seen through the mellow haze of late afternoon, had an air of serenity that struck her as faintly ironic. A gardener raked leaves with cheerful vigor, and somewhere a dog barked in lazy protest at being disturbed. Yet under that peaceful surface, Miss Marple sensed the tautness of concealed anxieties, like a carpet stretched carefully over an uneven floor. Sir Lewis received her in his study, a dark panelled room lined with leather-bound volumes that looked suspiciously as though they had never been opened. Maps of the estate and architectural drawings of the Temple of the Three Blind Monks were spread across his desk. "Miss Marple," he boomed, a trifle too heartily. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I wondered," she said gently, "if you might show me the temple. I have always been so interested in local architecture. And with all this unfortunate talk about curses and foreign statues, I thought it might be soothing to view the thing itself in its proper English setting." He hesitated, only for a heartbeat, then recovered himself. "Of course, Lydia," he called as his wife passed the open door. "Miss Marple is interested in seeing the temple. You might as well come too." Lydia Carmichael appeared in the doorway, pale as ever, but her expression contained a flicker of something like relief when she saw Miss Marple. "I'd be glad to," she said quietly. The temple stood at the far end of the ornamental lake, a charming 18th century folly with peeling white columns and a domed roof. Within, 3 empty niches punctuated the curved wall. "As you see," Sir Lewis said, gesturing toward them, awaiting their rightful occupants. "The 3 blind monks, if we can ever locate the wretched things. We know from family papers that they existed once. Your curate's statue, Miss Marple, might have been the missing second monk. Tragic business. His death." Miss Marple regarded the niches with mild interest. "So very symmetrical. I always think symmetry appeals to people with an orderly mind. 3 monks, 3 niches, 3. She broke off as her eyes fell on the stone floor. Near the central niche, where damp had darkened the flagstones, there was a faint rectangular outline, a patch of stone slightly cleaner than its surroundings, as though something heavy and recently removed had stood there for many years. "How curious," she observed. "Almost as though something once stood here, and has only lately been taken away. Something heavy, perhaps? A plinth? A statue?" Sir Lewis's gaze followed hers, and for a moment his jaw tightened. "Old damp marks," he said brusquely. "The roof leaked before the restoration. We've had work done." Lydia, standing slightly behind him, glanced quickly at Miss Marple, then away again. The look lasted less than a second, but it was quite sufficient. There had been something there, and not as long ago as Sir Lewis pretended. On their way back toward the house, an estate worker approached, cap in hand. "Begging your pardon, Sir Lewis. The men digging by the old north wall have found something. Looks like one of them foreign idols." Sir Lewis went very still. "I'll come at once. Miss Marple, perhaps you'd—" "Oh, but I should dearly like to see," she said, with the artless enthusiasm of a village spinster presented with an afternoon's unexpected entertainment. "I'm sure it must be most educational." The dig site lay in a neglected corner of the grounds, where the undergrowth had only recently been cut back. A shallow pit had been opened, and within it, half covered in soil, lay a second brass figure, a monk, seated blindfolded like the first. "Well, well," Sir Lewis breathed. "The first of the original 3. We shall have the complete set yet." Miss Marple gazed down at the figure, noting the corroded surface, the different style of blindfold, the older, darker patina. It resembled Pendergast's statue, yet was not identical. "A pity," she said softly, "that Mr. Finch Hadley did not live to see this. I rather think it would have interested him exceedingly." Sir Lewis shot her a sharp look. He saw all he needed to see, Miss Marple. "Yes," she agreed mildly. "I rather imagine he did." As she walked home later, the image of the newly unearthed monk lingered in her mind, alongside the missing original from the temple floor, the stolen statue from the police station, and the quietly terrified expression on Lydia Carmichael's face. 3 blind monks, 3 missing pieces, and somewhere among them, a very seeing murderer who had made one crucial miscalculation, assuming that Miss Marple, like the statues, could not see what was right before her eyes. The following morning brought the development Miss Marple had been quietly expecting, though it arrived in a form more dramatic than she would have chosen. Mrs. Bantry appeared at her gate, hat askew and cheeks flushed with the pleasurable horror of fresh scandal. "Jane, you must come at once," she cried. "There's been the most dreadful business at the temple. Vandalism. And, they say, attempted murder." Miss Marple, who had already noted an unusual amount of activity on the lane toward Carmichael Hall, took up her shawl with unhurried efficiency. "Perhaps you will tell me on the way, my dear." As they walked, Mrs. Bantry poured out the story. One of the estate gardeners found Mr. Bristow, you know, the gamekeeper, lying unconscious near the temple just after dawn. Head wound, blood everywhere. And inside the temple, somebody's been digging. The floor stones all pried up. Sir Lewis is in a fearful state. They reached the estate to find a small knot of villagers gathered at a respectful distance from the ornamental lake. Police constables moved briskly about, and Inspector Slack stood near the temple entrance, making notes with an air of gloomy satisfaction. The temple itself looked oddly violated, its door ajar and muddy boot prints leading in and out. Slack scowled when he saw Miss Marple, but did not attempt to send her away. "Nasty business. Bristow's in hospital with a fractured skull. Might pull through, might not. Temple floor's been levered up in places. Someone looking for something. I'd wager it's connected to your Finch Hadley gentleman." "Poor Bristow," Miss Marple murmured. "Such a steady man, and devoted to the estate. I wonder why he came upon the temple at just that time." "His rounds, apparently. Routine patrol," Slack said. "But whoever did this knew the layout. Went straight to the central area. Not a random vandal. And there's this." He nodded toward the interior. Inside, the temple bore the unmistakable scars of a hasty excavation. Several of the pale stone flags had been pried up, revealing dark earth beneath. One of the 3 niches bore fresh scratches, as if someone had been probing its base with a metal tool. The faint rectangular outline Miss Marple had noticed earlier was now a gaping hollow, its contents gone. "So," Miss Marple said softly, "whatever once stood there has now been removed completely." Sir Lewis appeared in the doorway, his usually ruddy face a mottled, unhealthy color. "Savages," he growled, "on my own property. The police think it's connected with that damned statue, of course, as if I hadn't suffered enough from that business." Miss Marple regarded him mildly. "And Mrs. Carmichael? This must all be very distressing for her." Confined to her room with a migraine, he snapped. "This sort of thing upsets delicate nerves." Yet Miss Marple, as they left, caught a glimpse of Lydia Carmichael at an upstairs window, pale face framed by the curtain, watching with an intensity that belied any incapacity. On the path back, they nearly collided with Dr. Haydock, hurrying toward the hall. He paused long enough to say in a low voice to Miss Marple, "Bristow's skull fracture looks more like a deliberate blow than a fall. Blunt instrument. Whoever did it meant business." "One might almost think," Miss Marple said quietly, "that someone was interrupted while searching, and took steps to ensure their privacy." By late afternoon, the village knew that Bristow had been struck from behind and that certain historical items were missing from the temple. What they did not know, but Miss Marple very much suspected, was that the assault marked a turning point. Someone had grown impatient, perhaps frightened. Murder, once committed, rarely remained singular, Violence, in her experience, bred more violence. That evening, as she sat with her knitting, Miss Marple considered the new pattern. Finch Hadley poisoned, the statue stolen from police custody, evidence planted against Pendergast, the temple ransacked, Bristow attacked. All acts pointed toward a single increasingly desperate hand. And yet, she reflected, it was not Sir Lewis Carmichael who had mud on his boots when she saw him that morning, but Lydia, mud still faintly staining the hem of an otherwise immaculate tweed skirt, and a small dark smear on the kid glove she had not quite managed to remove. The net was tightening. The question was not only who had killed and attacked, but who in that great house by the lake was truly in control. Miss Marple's plan began, characteristically, with tea and the appearance of simplicity. The next afternoon she invited Inspector Slack, Dr. Haydock, and Lady Carmichael to her cottage, making no mention of the true purpose behind the gathering. Only when they were all settled, cups in hand, did she introduce her little suggestion with the air of one proposing a harmless village outing. "I have been thinking," she began mildly, "that our poor Mr. Finch Hadley deserves the benefit of one final experiment. Dr. Haydock has his doubts about the exact method of poisoning, and I confess I share them. It occurs to me that a reconstruction at the temple might be most illuminating." Inspector Slack frowned. "What good will that do, Miss Marple? We've got a bottle of cyanide in the curate's study and a forged letter about the statue's value. That's motive and means enough for any jury." "Forged is such an interesting word," Miss Marple said placidly. "I wonder if you've examined the typeface on that letter recently, Inspector? It no longer matches the machine it was ostensibly written on. Still, I dare say the temple will clarify matters. If we could arrange for Sir Lewis to join us, under the pretext of demonstrating Finch Hadley's theory, we might all learn something of value." Lady Carmichael looked up sharply, understanding more than Slack did. "Lewis will never agree to a public confrontation, Miss Marple." "Oh, but it needn't appear as such," Miss Marple replied. "Merely tell him that Mr. Finch Hadley's notebook has been found, and that it contains details about the temple mechanism. A man so devoted to local history could hardly resist seeing his rival's solution tested. It was a mark of Lady Carmichael's desperation and her dawning trust in Miss Marple that she agreed." By late afternoon, the little party made its way to the temple, Inspector Slack with his habitual skepticism, Dr. Haydock curious, Lady Carmichael pale but resolved, and Miss Marple walking with the unhurried step of age that concealed a mind moving with precise speed. Sir Lewis was already there when they arrived, pacing before the temple with barely concealed agitation. He turned sharply as they approached. "What is the meaning of this, Lydia? You said the inspector needed my help with some final measurements." "In a manner of speaking," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "We have Mr. Finch Hadley's notebook, Sir Lewis. It describes a very ingenious mechanism, one involving pressure applied at noon to a particular stone when the shadows align." His eyes flickered, just for a moment, toward the central niche inside the temple. It was the smallest of movements, but to Miss Marple it was as good as a confession. "Superstitious nonsense," he snapped. "All this talk of hidden chambers and treasures. The temple is a folly. Nothing more. And yet Mr. Finch Hadley spent considerable time measuring it," Miss Marple continued softly. "He deduced that a concealed compartment must exist, large enough to conceal something of value. Diamonds, for instance, the Hadley diamonds that vanished when the temple was built." Inspector Slack shifted impatiently. "Is there a point to all this, Miss Marple?" "Oh yes, Inspector. A very simple one. If we follow Mr. Finch Hadley's instructions exactly, and the mechanism functions as he predicted, then we may assume his deductions were correct. In which case, the question becomes, who knew he had solved the puzzle, and who stood to lose most by his success? She moved, with deceptively frail steps, into the temple's interior. The late afternoon sun slanted through the doorway, casting long shadows along the stone floor. According to the notebook, she said, pressure applied here, she placed a hand lightly on a particular flagstone. At precisely this angle should suffice. Sir Lewis made an involuntary movement forward, then checked himself, his face draining of color as he realized, too late, that everyone had seen it. Miss Marple's fingers barely brushed the stone. She had no intention of actually triggering any mechanism. The true test, she knew, was not of ancient engineering, but of modern human nature. And Sir Lewis Carmichael had just proven, more conclusively than any hidden compartment could, that he knew exactly where and how Mr. Finch Hadley's discovery worked. In the days that followed Sir Lewis Carmichael's arrest, St. Mary Mead slowly resumed its customary rhythms, though with a new topic to occupy its teapots and doorstep conversations. The Temple of the Three Blind Monks, once merely an ornamental curiosity, had become the focal point of a tale involving murder, hidden treasure, and the unmasking of a respected local figure. Miss Marple, however, found no special satisfaction in the drama of it all. She thought instead of young Mr. Pendergast, whose narrow escape from ruin was little comfort against the memory of his brief imprisonment and the shadow of suspicion that had hung over him. That shadow was formally dispelled one damp afternoon in the vicarage drawing-room, where Inspector Slack, Dr. Haydock, the vicar, and a pale but newly hopeful Pendergast had assembled. Miss Marple, sitting with her knitting in her lap, was gently pressed to explain how it all fit together. It began, she said, with something that did not quite behave as it should. Contact poison on a hot brass statue ought to have produced almost instantaneous collapse. Yet Mr. Finch Hadley remained standing, even spoke, before he fell. That suggested he touched something else after the statue, something already prepared with cyanide. His notebook, Dr. Haydock interjected. The page edges showed faint traces when we examined it yesterday. He must have picked it up again after handling the statue. Just so, Miss Marple agreed. Sir Lewis, having poisoned the blindfold earlier, needed only to ensure that Mr. Finch Hadley would handle both the statue and the notebook in quick succession. The statue gave the appearance of the source, but the true fatal contact came from the object the victim trusted most, his own research. But the evidence against me, Pendergast said quietly. The bottle, the letter. How did you know they were false? It reminded me very much, Miss Marple said, of a case in which a young man of good character was accused of theft because the stolen banknotes turned up in his bureau drawer, so very conveniently that only a fool would not suspect him. Real criminals rarely oblige us by behaving so obligingly. The cyanide in your study, the letter from the supposed antique dealer, they were altogether too perfect. Inspector Slack shifted uncomfortably. And the typewriter? He asked gruffly. The misaligned E was quite distinctive, Miss Marple replied. It appeared in the forged letter, and Miss Abernathy confirmed Sir Lewis's machine had precisely that defect until recently repaired. When I received a threatening note with perfectly aligned E's, I knew the writer had taken great care to avoid repeating that mistake, and great care, in my experience, is most often a sign of guilt. The vicar, who had been listening with mounting indignation on his curate's behalf, spoke up. And the temple? Mr. Finch Hadley's notebook revealed he had already solved its secret, Miss Marple explained. Sir Lewis had spent years and a small fortune trying to do the same. When he realized this outsider held the key to the treasure, his jealousy and desperation overcame whatever conscience he possessed. Pendergast bowed his head. "I never suspected the statue was of such importance," he murmured. Uncle Silas always spoke of his curiosities as trifles. "Very wise of him," Miss Marple said softly. "Objects that seem valueless are rarely the subject of theft or murder. It is when their worth becomes known that danger follows." Later, walking home past the temple, which now stood under official guardianship, Miss Marple paused to regard the folly in the fading light. The central niche gaped empty. The 2 remaining brass monks and the Hadley diamonds had been removed to secure storage pending legal determinations. A place built to house curiosities, she reflected, had instead housed a very human tragedy. Not the workings of any curse, but of envy, pride, and greed. The same old failings that had troubled villages long before anyone dreamed of Eastern temples or blindfolded monks. And yet, life in St. Mary Mead went on. The roses would bloom again in the vicarage garden. The vicar would preach on the perils of covetousness with unusual fervor, and Mrs. Bantry would tell the story of the temple murder at every opportunity, embroidering it gently with each telling. As for Miss Marple, she returned to her knitting and her garden, content to let others speak of curses and treasures. She knew, as she always had, that the most dangerous temples were not those built of stone, but those erected in the human heart, where desire, once enthroned, demanded sacrifices far more terrible than any idol of brass. In the weeks that followed, St. Mary Mead did what English villages have always done in the wake of scandal and tragedy. It settled, slowly and stubbornly, back into its customary rhythm, while never quite forgetting. Life resumed, gardens were tended, teas poured, parish meetings convened, but beneath it all ran a faint, metallic thread of unease, like a taste one could not entirely wash from the mouth. News of Sir Lewis Carmichael's confession spread beyond the village, of course. The newspapers were delighted. Industrial magnate in temple murder. And for a few days the press cars thickened on the lanes like autumn leaves. Yet even their interest waned eventually, giving way to fresher sensations. Sir Lewis's solicitors began the complicated task of disentangling his finances, while he awaited trial in a remand cell, stripped at last of the respectability he had prized more than any jewel. It was decided, after much discussion among the Carmichael trustees and what remained of the Hadley family, that the Hadley diamonds should be placed on long-term loan to the British Museum. The Temple of the 3 Blind Monks would remain as a local curiosity, open to visitors twice a week under strict supervision. "You will come, of course, Miss Marple," Mrs. Bantry declared, when the formal reopening was arranged. "After all, it's rather your temple now, in a way." "My dear, I hope not," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Temples attached to murders tend to be more trouble than they are worth." Still, she went. On a clear, pale morning she joined a small gathering at the Folly, the vicar and Mrs. Clement, Dr. Haydock, Mrs. Bantry, a few solemn-looking gentlemen from London, and Lady Carmichael, dressed in unadorned black. Her beauty, shorn of its usual trappings of wealth and status, was somehow more honest now, if sadder. The 3 brass monks had been carefully restored to their niches, one recovered from the police, the other 2 brought out from their secret chamber. Polished, but not ostentatiously so, they sat side by side, their banded eyes turned forever inward. "Odd, isn't it?" Dr. Haydock murmured to Miss Marple. "They look so very peaceful, considering the trouble they've caused." "I don't think it was they who caused the trouble, Doctor," Miss Marple replied. "Idols are quite powerless on their own. It is always the worshippers one must look at." Inspector Slack, unexpectedly present in plain clothes, approached her afterward with a somewhat sheepish air. "I'll say this, Miss Marple, you were right about the curate. I don't mind admitting I was a bit hasty." "Hasty decisions are quite understandable, Inspector, when the evidence appears so obliging," Miss Marple said kindly. One must remember that evidence, like people, may be arranged to present a particular impression. He grunted, but there was respect in it. We'd have hanged the wrong man, you know, in the old days. Yes, Miss Marple said quietly. I know. At the vicarage, Mr. Pendergast resumed his duties with a humility that did him credit. His sermons, once mild and somewhat earnest, now possessed a depth that the older parishioners found unexpectedly moving. Sin is rarely theatrical, he said one Sunday, his gaze lingering for a moment on Miss Marple's pew. It begins in very small indulgences, very reasonable justifications, and only later reveals the ruin it has been quietly preparing. Lady Carmichael, meanwhile, elected to leave the hall and remove to a smaller house in Bath. On her last day in the village, she called on Miss Marple to say farewell. I sometimes wonder, she said, standing by the cottage window and looking out at the neat garden beds, whether things might have been different if someone had truly opposed Lewis earlier, not the kind of opposition that shouts, but the kind that refuses to look away. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, but one can never be entirely sure. Some people are determined to walk into darkness, no matter how many lamps are lit along the path. When she was alone again, Miss Marple took up her knitting and allowed her thoughts to drift back over the tangled threads of the Temple affair. A careless note, a misplaced notebook, a too clever forgery, such small things, yet revealing. In the end, it had not been exotic curses or ancient mechanisms that solved the mystery, but the same quiet truths she had observed all her life in gardens, drawing rooms, and village lanes. People, she reflected, were never very different from one place to another. Whether in a Himalayan temple or an English folly, whether hunting lost diamonds or merely nursing petty grievances over parish flowers, they betrayed themselves in the same small, human ways. Outside, the church bell chimed the hour. The three blind monks sat in their stone niches, eyes banded, guarding nothing now but an empty space where greed had once imagined treasure. In a small cottage on the lane, an elderly lady counted her stitches, quite composed, quietly certain that somewhere, if not in St. Mary Mead, then in some other seemingly peaceful corner of the world, human nature was already at work upon its next little tragedy. Winter had just begun to show its teeth when Mrs. Bantry arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, cheeks pink from the cold and eyes bright with the undimmed curiosity that had seen her faithfully through every scandal St. Mary Mead had ever produced. "My dear Jane," she announced, shrugging off her fur-collared coat in the hallway, "you have been disgracefully close about this whole temple business. Everyone knows you solved it, of course, but no one can quite agree how. I consider it positively uncharitable of you not to enlighten your oldest friends." Miss Marple, who was pouring tea with her usual unhurried precision, allowed herself a small, indulgent smile. "I thought everyone had heard quite enough about it at the trial." "Heard bits of it," Mrs. Bantry retorted, settling herself by the fire, in that dreadful, legal, chopped-up way. "I want the story properly. When did you first suspect Sir Lewis?" Miss Marple considered. "Not at once. At the tea party, I merely noticed 3 things that did not fit together. Mr. Finch Hadley referred to the statue privately as a cheap copy, yet publicly valued it at several £100. Sir Lewis showed a quite excessive eagerness to buy it on the spot. And then there was his reaction when the poor man died. Far less shock than calculation." "Calculation?" He looked, not at the body, Dolly, but at the statue. Just for a moment, as though wondering whether it had done its work. Mrs. Bantry shivered deliciously. "You do make it sound rather horrid, Jane." It was horrid. Murder usually is. Then later I learned he had been at the vicarage alone with the statue before the party. That was suggestive. But the police found cyanide on the blindfold. Mrs. Bantry objected. Slack said so himself. Yes, they found cyanide where they had been told to look, Miss Marple corrected gently. That is quite a different thing. It was Dr. Haydock who really made it clear, though I doubt he realized. The delay between Finch Hadley touching the statue and his collapse was too long for direct contact poisoning. He must have contacted the real poison elsewhere, quite possibly in the course of some private experiment of Sir Lewis's that went wrong rather earlier than intended. The statue was dressed with poison afterwards to support the story. Mrs. Bantry stared. So the blindfold was part of the staging, just as the planted letter in the curate's desk and the bottle behind the brick were part of the staging. A little too neat, I always think, when everything points in one convenient direction. And the notebook? That was the key, wasn't it? In more ways than one, Miss Marple agreed. It showed that Finch Hadley had solved the temple's secret first. That provided the proper motive. Greed alone rarely leads to murder, you know. It must be mixed with humiliation or fear, or both. She paused to thread a new length of wool into her knitting. Outside, the bare branches of the sycamore tapped gently against the window, like an old finger making a point. You see, Dolly, Sir Lewis could have borne losing the treasure, I dare say, if no one else had found it. But to have a stranger triumph where he had failed, that, I think, was intolerable to his pride. Pride is a much more dangerous thing than mere avarice. Mrs. Bantry was silent for a moment, watching the fire. And the 3 blind monks, she said at last. It was rather poetic, don't you think? A man blinded by his own obsession, undone by a set of blind statues. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Poetic, perhaps, but also very ordinary. I have known any number of people ruined by the same failing, though without quite so dramatic a setting. Whether it is diamonds in a temple or a small legacy in a village, human nature behaves much the same. Mrs. Bantry sighed contentedly. I suppose that is why you always see through people, Jane. You never expect them to be better, or worse than they are. Oh, but I do hope they will be better. Miss Marple corrected her gently. I merely observe that, as a rule, they are not. The fire crackled, the kettle hummed, and outside, St. Mary Mead lay under a thin veil of frost, peaceful, self-contained, and, to the untrained eye, entirely innocent. Miss Marple, her needles clicking softly, knew better. Somewhere, someone would already be embarking on the first small, foolish step toward their own little tragedy. But for the moment, there was tea, and warmth, and the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle completed. In the gentle way of English villages, the story of the Temple of the 3 Blind Monks slowly shifted from raw scandal to polished anecdote, something to be spoken of in lowered tones over tea, embellished here and there, yet never quite stripped of its chill. Time did not erase what had happened, but it softened the sharper edges, as moss softens old stone. Life, obstinately and properly, went on. The temple itself, now locked and barred, stood as a picturesque silhouette against the sky. Visitors sometimes asked why such a charming folly was closed, and the villagers would exchange glances, each silently daring the other to begin. The most restrained would merely say, "There was trouble," while the less restrained might lean forward and murmur, "Murder," with the peculiar relish that only distance from danger can bring. One afternoon, some months after the trial, Mr. Pendergast called at Miss Marple's cottage, carrying a bulky parcel carefully tied with string. He looked thinner, but steadier. His eyes no longer held that hunted look she had seen in them during his ordeal. "I've brought you something," he said, slightly abashed. "A small token of gratitude. The bishop says I owe my vocation, perhaps my life, to your..." discernment. He untied the string and revealed a framed photograph, the three brass monks, now installed behind glass at the British Museum, their blindfolded faces gleaming under professional lighting. Beneath them, in neat lettering, was the inscription, "The three blind monks from the Carmichael Temple, St. Mary Mead," associated with the discovery of the Hadley Diamond's 18th C. "I thought you might like a reminder," he added, "of how you saved a very foolish young man from the gallows." Miss Marple regarded the photograph with a faint smile. "My dear Mr. Pendergast, you were foolish only in the way that young men often are, careless with practical matters, over-trusting of those who should not be trusted, and quite unaware of how your actions might appear to others. That is less criminal than instructional." He colored slightly. "I suppose I have learned a great deal about appearances." "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. "You have learned what Sir Lewis never did, that how we seem to others can be as important as what we are. He tried to preserve the appearance of respectability at all costs, until he valued it more than truth itself. That is a very dangerous exchange. After he left, she placed the photograph on her mantel, beside a faded snapshot of the vicarage garden and a small china shepherdess. The blindfolded monks seemed oddly at home among such domestic trifles, their solemn stillness a silent commentary on the dramas that had played out in their name. Some days later, Dr. Haydock stopped by with his usual brusque kindness, ostensibly to check her rheumatism, but in reality, as both of them knew perfectly well, to hear her final thoughts on the affair. "One thing I still don't quite see," he admitted, leaning back in his chair. "You were certain of Sir Lewis before we'd anything like proof. What tipped the balance, in your mind?" Miss Marple's knitting moved steadily. Three small things, really. First, that he spoke of the statue's value before anyone had suggested it might be more than a mere curiosity. That showed foreknowledge. Second, that he was far too ready to embrace the curse theory in public. Men who cling to superstition often do so to distract from something more practical. And third, that he underestimated the village. He imagined no one would notice gloves on a summer afternoon, a moved cloth, a chemical smell. But villages, Doctor, notice everything, especially when they believe they are noticing nothing at all. Dr. Haydock chuckled. "You make it sound inevitable. Nothing about murder is inevitable," Miss Marple replied softly. "That is its greatest sadness. There are always a dozen small turnings where someone might have chosen differently. Sir Lewis might have chosen humility. Lady Carmichael might have chosen to speak sooner. Even Mr. Finch Hadley might have chosen cooperation over competition. None did. And so, we ended where such roads always end." Outside, the church bell rang the hour. The sound drifted gently across the village, over tidy hedges and well-swept paths, past the shuttered temple and the empty Carmichael Hall, over the mill pond where a boy's fishing line had snagged a damning notebook. Miss Marple rose to draw the curtains as evening fell. In her quiet way, she felt the case settle into the long gallery of memories she kept so precisely, another pattern of vanity, fear, and folly filed alongside so many others. The three blind monks, their secret now exposed, had done their unintentional work. They had shown, yet again, that it was never temples or treasures that led to tragedy, but the hearts of those who coveted them. As she set her knitting aside for the night, Miss Marple reflected that people, for all their sins and foolishness, remained endlessly interesting. And so long as that was true, she thought, there would always be mysteries, and, fortunately, always old women, quietly watching, and remembering, and understanding.